Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, with many considering 8 gigs of VRAM as the bare minimum for graphics cards these days, a lot of older, less equipped but still once capable options are going cheap. Today we're looking at the GTX 1650 Super, a 4GB GPU that launched in November 2019, about 7 months after the original 1650. The 1650 non-Super wasn't particularly exciting, costing $150 and falling short of AMD's RX 570. The Super card, on the other hand, had an MSRP of $160, just 10 more than its non-Super counterpart, but offered way better performance, at least 30% on average at 1080p, according to a couple of older reviews I found. The main drawback was probably the VRAM, which wasn't too concerning back in 2019, but fast forward almost 6 years, and it'll be interesting to see how this once solid sub 200 gamer is holding up. So let's find out. I've paired it with my modest gaming rig consisting of the i5 12400F and 32 gigs of 3200MHz DDR4. Now, the odds are stacked against the 1650 Super in 2025, not just because of the card's ability to play games, but we also have the 4 gigs of VRAM, plus a lot of titles these days just seem to be not that well optimised. We'll start with Oblivion Remastered here, which does give us a warning regarding the VRAM. It actually says that 6 gigs is suggested. Now, this isn't what I'd call the most optimised game in the world anyway, and it can give some of my more mid-range or higher end hardware a run for its money. Therefore, I was surprised to see it running at plus 30 frames per second, but as you can see, we've had to make some pretty big visual sacrifices. This does have a couple of upscaling options, but they don't really help, so running at 30% resolution scale with the lowest settings is the best bet. Pretty hard on the eyes though. Next up we have Call of Duty Black Ops 7. This is of course the open beta. I think it's ended by the time that this video goes up, but it should give us some idea of how the final game will perform. Here I'm using the minimum preset, of course at 1080p, but we also have FSR 3 enabled. This is set to balanced mode. We actually saw 90 frames per second with a 1% low of 60 and a 0.1% low of 50, so you may be thinking, well, perhaps we can turn the FSR upscaling down a bit or the settings up a bit, but there are some maps that will perform worse. I can't remember what it was called, but I played another map whereby we were just about getting 60 FPS, 62 or 63, so some may be more demanding than others, and therefore I think it's best to stick with minimum with FSR 3 balanced here for a decent gaming experience across all of the included maps here. We'll have to see how performance differs when the final game releases. No problems whatsoever with Counter-Strike 2 here. I'd suggest using a lower preset or the lowest settings in this one, to be honest, for as many frames as possible, but as a GPU benchmark I thought we'd just go with the high preset, see what happened, and with AA off we were getting over 150 frames per second, 171 here with a 1% low of 99 and a 0.1% low of 69, so a pretty nice gameplay experience here, and we don't really have to be concerned with the 4 gigs of VRAM in this one. The same can be said for Apex Legends really, 1080p with the high textures, everything else set to lowest. TSAA was also enabled for 178 frames per second. I thought we may as well push the textures to high just to make the game look a little bit better. And yeah, performance, again, just like in CS2, nothing really to complain about here. More than playable on the 1650 Super in 2025. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 surprised me. 1080p once again, of course, with the low preset here, so basically all the settings were at low. We also had FSR 3.1 enabled and set to balanced mode here. This actually gave us over 60 FPS, 74 to be exact. Now, I was thinking that performance was going to get worse the longer we played, and while there were a few little hiccups here and there, and a few texture pop-ins, as you can see, probably because of the limited VRAM, performance actually held steady over my half-hour gameplay session. It did drop towards 60 FPS in the more densely packed areas like forests and things like that, but it actually wasn't too bad at all. 60 FPS was doable pretty much most of the time in this one, providing we have FSR 3.1 enabled. We can run at native resolution with at least 30 frames per second, but I don't think this is too much of a significant sacrifice to the visuals in order to hit 60. Now GTA 5 Enhanced is up next. I'd recommend sticking to the legacy version with older and weaker cards, but with a 1650 Super here, it's absolutely fine with the high preset for 99 FPS and some pretty solid percentile lows. I did also select the very high preset to see what would happen, and while we still saw at least 60 FPS most of the time, there were a few dips and drops below that, and visually it doesn't look too different. Of course, we're locked out of the newly added ray tracing options with this card, but it's nice to know that we can still play the enhanced version with some of the upgraded effects here on this 4GB GPU from 2019, and you're going to have a decent experience in doing so. Cyberpunk 2077 surprised me. There will be a lot of moments where we see less than 60 FPS, but with the low preset and FSR3 enabled and set to auto mode, the average actually came back at 60 frames per second. No, sorry, 64 frames per second. What I was going to say is that we actually saw at least 60 frames per second a lot of the time. It doesn't look the best, of course, but I was quite surprised that it doesn't look completely terrible either, even with FSR3 set to auto. So we're just letting the game do its thing, and even with the 4GB 1650 Super, performance is okay, pretty decent to be honest. Not much to say about Hollow Knight Silksong here in terms of performance, because as expected it performed really well with the particle flex set to normal and the blur quality set to high. These are basically the high settings for the game. We saw almost 700 FPS, 686 to be exact, a 1% low of 394 and a 0.1% low of 15. This was because when we sort of went between different areas, the screen goes black for a second, and this causes a little dip in the frame time. So when actually playing, as you can see here, the frame rate graph, or the frame time graph I should say, is smooth as anything. No problems here. Clair Obscur Expedition 33 next with the lowest settings, an XeSS set to Ultra Performance. I didn't have to set it to Ultra Performance until we got to this crowded area, so we were actually starting off with Performance mode. It may have even been balanced and we were getting 35-40 FPS, but as soon as we move into anywhere with a lot going on screen, like here for example, well, we're going to see quite the dip in performance, unfortunately. With Red Dead Redemption 2, I stuck with the ultra textures and set everything else to its respective lowest. We also had 8x anisotropic filtering enabled, the geometry LOD was set to max, the grass LOD was set to 2 out of 10, and TAA was enabled and set to medium for 76 frames per second. I think we could have turned up some of the other settings, perhaps to medium or even high, especially if you don't mind plus 30 FPS, and I was actually quite surprised to see this result here. So with the ultra textures, it looks really good, even with everything else set to low, to be honest, and it's more than playable on this 4GB GPU. With Fortnite, I went with the medium preset here, and TAA started off with a low preset where we saw almost 200 frames per second, or at least 150, put it that way. So I thought, why not push things up to medium for a little more graphical fidelity, and yeah, still absolutely fine, 127 frames per second, a 1% low of 91 and a 0.1% low of 62 in DX12 mode, so nothing to complain about here. Pretty smooth overall and more than playable on this 4GB 1650 Super. I don't know what I was thinking really, trying Borderlands 4 on this thing. Wasn't expecting much. This is problematic on a lot of my hardware at the best of times, and with the 1650 Super, the lowest settings enabled and FSR Ultra Performance switched on, so as low as we can go, we saw 26 FPS overall. We did see 30 sometimes, but it feels pretty jarring to play, and it's not very easy on the eyes either, so perhaps Borderlands 4 is best left avoided on a 1650 Super in 2025. Let's finalise with Baldur's Gate 3 with the medium preset. Low is probably your best bet to avoid some of those dips and drops below 60 FPS, but we can actually push things to medium here with TAA for plus 60 frames per second, 62 overall. I don't think frame rate is as important in this one. It's not your fast-paced sort of action shooter, but it's always nice to have 60 FPS, and that is doable in this situation with this card. So there we are, the 1650 Super in 2025. There are going to be games, of course, that don't run very well at all. Some games that won't even start. Doom, The Dark Ages comes to mind because we don't have the hardware ray tracing capabilities. Of course, others will struggle. Clair Obscur and Oblivion Remastered come to mind, but you can still have a pretty good time with the 1650 Super. It totally depends on what you're playing, and considering it's a 4GB GPU from 2019, sub £200 or dollars at the time, I don't think it's doing too badly, and I'm sure there are lots of you still using this and having a decent time with it, so let me know if you are down below. Thanks as always for watching, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.